Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, it is a crazy weekend in Mexico, particularly in Mexico City, because not only have we been celebrating the Formula One races last weekend, but for the last couple of years, I would say for the last 5 years, maybe a little bit more, there's just more and more parades in Mexico City, and I think in different parts of Mexico, celebrating the Day of the Dead, or the Day of the Dearly Departed, Dia de los Muertos, and it's become a huge festivity in Mexico. I've been living in Mexico City for more than 20 years now, and I have to say that during these last 20 years, the this Dia de los Muertos has become a huge celebration, and it wasn't that big, particularly in the northern part of of Mexico. I grew up in the northern part of Mexico, and we recognized it. Many see it as a religious holiday, but also many people, regardless of where you are in Mexico, would go to the cemeteries and go and visit their dearly beloved, departed beloved. And so it's a celebration of deceased relatives and friends. And what supposedly or the tradition is that you are supposed to be inviting their spirits to return that day, remembering them with, you remember them with food, color, and music. So it's a very special event. Especially if you go to the cemeteries, and you can see people bringing mariachi and food, and it's a celebration in many ways, although you're in a cemetery, it's a celebration of life. Like I said, in the central part of Mexico, it's always been a huge celebration, and it's kind of linked to the indigenous groups, indigenous cultures of more central and southern part of Mexico, but it has become a spectacle, and it even more so because there's kind of this blend between Halloween that is celebrated in the United States and Dia de los Muertos here in Mexico. So if you go to almost, I'm not going to say every home, but if you walk around the city right now, you're going to find these ofrendas and these altars, which, they have certain characteristics. They have photos of those who are deceased, marigolds, very important. In Spanish, they're called cempasúchil. They have candles that are supposed to illuminate the way and symbolize remembrance, so people can come that day and visit with their relatives. When I say them, I'm talking our beloved departed. Food and drink. I mean, I have in my altar here in my house, my father loved Diet Coke and my mom loved chocolate. So that's what we have, Diet Coke and chocolate. Incense is very important. There's a very special smell. It's called copal. And then there's sugar skulls and calaveritas. And in addition, throughout these days, they have also this tradition of doing these special poems that are called calaveritas. And unfortunately, I don't have, some of them were written for me a couple years ago. I'm going to see if I can find them. But that's it. So it's a huge tradition. And in most places around the country, it's a holiday. And since it's Saturday this year, so I mean, people aren't going to be missing school, but clearly they are not going to go to work. And it's 2 days. The first day you celebrate the children and babies who died. And then on the second day, November 2nd, you celebrate everybody else in your family that have died, or friends, because you also celebrate friends. Anyway, there is a very interesting mesh that has taken place between the US culture celebrating Halloween and the Mexican culture celebrating Dia de Muertos. And I really appreciate today's guest, who has kind of specialized in Chicano art, Chicano culture. And I know Mathew Sandoval, who's a professor at ASU out in Phoenix and in Arizona. I know you've written about this, but it is fascinating how to see how these two cultures have melded in the last in the last years. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me as a guest today. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Just tell us, I mean, just describe to us this melding of the US celebration of Halloween and the Mexican celebration of Dia de Muertos.
Yeah, so the first thing that I would say is that it's happening on both sides of the border. This melding
Mhm,
and meshing of Halloween and Dia de los Muertos has been happening really for the past 50 years at least. So most of the research that I do begins from the 1970s forward. And so
mhm,
one of the fascinating things to just to think about Dia de los Muertos' influence on American Halloween is that among Mexican Americans in the United States who celebrate Dia de los Muertos, beginning in the 1970s and 80s, they started to inflect or add elements of Halloween into their Dia de los Muertos. Of course, in the United States, Halloween is much more popular than Dia de los Muertos, even among Mexican Americans. And so you had, in a very strategic way, Mexican American individuals and communities starting to add elements of Halloween to their traditional Dia de los Muertos festivities. And one of the first things that that looks like is the idea of painting one's face a la calaca, meaning like a sugar skull, so that you paint your face to look as if you are the incarnation of death. That's not a tradition in Mexico at all. If you were to look through newspapers in Mexico, especially in Mexico City, to see how Dia de los Muertos was celebrated prior to the 1970s, 80s, etc., you would see people who might wear masks, skull masks, traditionally, usually either paper mache or wooden carved masks as part of Dia de los Muertos. So there was a masking that happened in Mexico, but they wouldn't paint their faces. The idea of painting one's face to look like a sugar skull actually begins in the United States, thanks to Mexican Americans who start to really blend and blur these two holidays of Halloween and Dia de los Muertos. So that becomes a strong tradition in the United States. So if you were to come to the United States for Dia de los Muertos, you're going to see a lot of people dressed in sugar skull face paint and dressed as calaveras, calacas, etc. And
mhm.
now that tradition has traveled south. So now it's a really common tradition in Mexico for people to paint their faces a la calaca. In fact, if you were in Mexico City this week, there are probably makeup artists on the street everywhere you go to be able to paint your face. The only reason that that's become a popular tradition in Mexico is because of the melding and merging between Halloween and Dia de los Muertos.
You
Uh,
know, that's fascinating because there was also, this very famous cartoonist, Posadas, that used
Mhm,
to reflect the Mexican political and the Mexican political elite and economic elite as calacas, as
mhm,
skeletons. And that's where you have the Catrinas. I don't know if you can see some of my Catrinas behind me for those of you who are watching this show via YouTube Live. You can see that it's also an art form. I mean, it has really become an art form that has become very popular, as you said. I mean, I walked into Walmart and they have calacas or skulls made in China. So I
mhm,
was just like, and it's become, as Halloween is a big business in the United States, it's become a big business in Mexico.
mhm,
But I think what was a very important moment is when they do they filmed the James Bond movie in Mexico City, and
mhm,
that was when they recreated a parade that did not exist in Mexico City for this movie, and it's become now a tradition every year to have the Dia de los Muertos parade. And in the case of Mexico City, also they also have a parade a week or 2 weeks before of the Catrinas.
mhm.
So and everybody marches and that. So it's a huge festivity, but it does have a religious connotation.
Hmm. Yeah, it certainly does have a religious connotation, although, based on the research and interviews that I've been doing for over a decade, I would say many people celebrate Dia de los Muertos not necessarily as a religious holiday, even
Hmm.
though the holiday has religious roots, definitely,
Hmm.
and is definitely a spiritual tradition, that most people, both in Mexico and the United States, celebrate it as a cultural thing. which is
Hmm.
to say it's part of our cultural heritage, and we
Hmm.
celebrate it because it's a part of our cultural heritage. You know, most of the interviews that I've done with people both in Mexico and the United States, when I ask them whether they believe that the spirits of the dead literally come back from the land of the dead to the land of the living,
Hmm.
almost always people say that they do not believe that, that they don't have
Hmm.
that actual spiritual belief that they truly, truly come back, that it's more symbolic. So it's religious in some fundamental way, but it's also, I would say, much more deeply cultural, even though I
Hmm.
understand it's sometimes hard
Oh,
to.
it's a huge party too. I mean,
Mhm.
this is although you are celebrating the death of beloved ones, it is a huge party now, and it's become also a very successful tourist attraction for different parts of Mexico and Mexico City, and well, Mexico
100%.
in general.
Mexico in general, but that has everything to do with the fact that beginning in the 1930s, the Mexican government really did put a lot of emphasis and resources into cultural tourism as
Hmm.
a way to kind of revitalize the economy after the revolution. When the government
Right.
had big projects but didn't have a whole lot of money, it started to
Hmm.
reach out and started to try and invite travelers from across the globe to come and visit Mexico so that they could pump tourist dollars into Mexico and help regenerate the economy. And one of the things that the Mexican government, quote unquote, started to sell in the 1930s was Dia de los Muertos, inviting people to come down to experience Dia de los Muertos. So the idea that now in Mexico, especially Mexico City, that literally millions of people descend upon the city in order to experience Dia de los Muertos is also not really that new of a phenomenon. It's about 100 years in the making at this point.
Wow. So, joining us today is Mathew Sandoval. He's a professor at Arizona State University. He's an expert. He has written about this kind of melding of the culture. You just published a book. Can you show us the? I saw you just published this book. Why as well? And the
Yeah,
name of the book is
Dia de los
Dia.
Muertos, a Chicano Arts Legacy. Um,
Uh,
and the book is about the way that Mexican American artists in the United States, as part of the Mexican American civil rights movement, helped
mhm.
revitalize Dia de los Muertos in the United States as a way to help Mexican Americans reconnect with their Mexican heritage at a time when we were fighting for our civil rights.
It's difficult times right now for Mexican Americans, for undocumented people in the United States. Has this in any way impacted? Can you see the celebration of Dia de los Muertos in Arizona?
Yeah, our political moment is deeply impacting Dia de los Muertos in very specific ways here right now. I would
Hmm.
say the most profound way that it's affecting Day of the Dead is there's a lot of community celebrations where our Latino community in the United States come out together and collectively celebrate Dia de los Muertos at different festivities.
Hmm.
We're seeing that those numbers are down this year
Right.
in large part because a lot of people are fearful of gathering in public
Hmm.
for fear of ICE raids. The idea that ICE is coming after people in their schools, they're coming after people at soccer games. There's no reason to believe that they won't be coming after us in our public celebrations of even our ancestral traditions like Dia de los Muertos. So these are definitely scary times.
Hmm.
A lot of the funding in the United States has been cut pretty much for everything, all the arts, all the humanities, pretty much. There's no
Hmm.
money right now because the Trump administration doesn't want to delegate money towards those things. And so
Hmm.
communities that rely on federal, state, and local funding to put on their Dia de los Muertos fiestas are
Hmm.
having a really hard time putting those on this year because there's just no money available for the arts and cultures right now in the United States.
So let's start thinking towards the future. I mean, there is this already there is a debate in Mexico in terms of rejecting the Halloween tradition, and it's the Halloween tradition. And I remember in Hermosillo, you'd have we really couldn't go trick or treating, and it was something among among the Americans who would do they would organize themselves to do trick or treating. Then it became throughout the years a good reason to go out and ask for candy, not only on Halloween night, but just kind of like the whole week. And then it became an opportunity for communities with lesser resources to go and knock on doors and get, ask for money and ask for food and ask for candy. But I've seen a reaction, I don't know if you've seen it, from Mexican, people who want to keep the Dia de los Muertos tradition separate from the Halloween tradition. And I was talking to a person who was telling me that in her pueblo, the priest is basically asking the kids not to dress up as, witches and Frankenstein and scary monsters, but to dress up in more religious figures. So there, I mean, there is a clash of cultures going on here.
Yeah, I've definitely, in my own interviews in traveling to Mexico and studying Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, I've definitely heard that. I've seen that. I've interviewed people who have legitimate fears that Halloween is encroaching on Dia de los Muertos and making this long-standing cultural tradition maybe more American or maybe turning it into something that it was never supposed to be. I think those
Mhm.
fears are real. I think those fears are legitimate. But I also feel like there's no stopping the tide at this point. And I'm thinking of like the first people who started to write about this were Mexican anthropologists in the 1980s who were
Mhm.
noticing even in the 1980s that in some communities in Mexico, you were finding more Halloween elements entering Dia de los Muertos, that people were putting out pumpkins and things like that, or dressing like witches even on Dia de los
Mhm.
Muertos. And then it becomes exacerbated in the 1990s thanks to
Mhm.
NAFTA and the idea of the United States pumping all kinds of American culture, including and especially Halloween, into
Mhm.
Mexico. Um, and now, by virtue of the fact that we're also globally interconnected by virtue of social media, the media in general, I think it would be difficult for young Mexican kids right now to kind of keep Halloween away because it's everywhere they turn. You know, the
Mhm.
most popular movies in Mexico year after year are American horror movies.
Right.
Those are the things that sell really well, which is to say, Halloween sells really well in Mexico. So
Mhm.
keeping a line between Halloween and Dia de los Muertos in Mexico is going to be incredibly difficult because the cultural tide is already starting to move in a
Well,
particular way.
you tell a kid don't go trick or treating or don't get
Oh, yeah.
candy. I mean,
The
you
first
can't.
thing they're going to do.
That's the first thing they're going to do. Matthew Sandoval, a professor at Arizona State University, he specializes in Chicano culture. He's been writing about this, about Dia de los Muertos in Mexico and how it's celebrated in the United States. I really appreciate you joining us here on Living in Mexico. Hopefully, you'll come back soon.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to a break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar.